Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
There we go. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast, episode 76, the Elm Programming Language. I am your host today, Justin Ribeiro. Danny and Eric are out. And today with me, I have Richard. Richard, how's it going today?
Going well.
So please, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get wrangled into the wonderful world of web and programming things?
Well, I guess I started out when I was 9 programming BASIC. So the way I got into the web was many years later. I guess there was no web back then, but I got into it basically because I wanted to start a company, and the company was going to be around an idea that ran on the web. And so I figured I'd have to learn it. So I did. And sort of fell in love with it and have been building for the web ever since.
Wonderful. I mean, yeah, the web is a nice place to go. I actually started in BASIC as well when I was 7. My mom taught me how to make a waving flag.
Nice.
So, you know, it's I always find it interesting where people start out. And you work on the Elm Programming Language. So tell us a little bit about Elm.
Elm is a functional programming language that compiles to JavaScript. I came across it a number of years ago when I was building this writing app, and I wanted it to work offline so I could use it on an airplane, like bring it up and use it offline with app cache, because there actually wasn't Service Worker back then, IndexedDB and the whole nine with all that. And eventually I'd been sort of getting more and more into the functional programming idea, just writing my JavaScript and CoffeeScript in a more functional style. And I decided I wanted to try like a proper, like, design from the ground up to be functional programming language and see what that was like. And for a number of reasons, I ended up choosing Elm, and I absolutely loved it. It was fantastic. It took me back to when I was like 10 years old doing Visual Basic, being like, I can make UIs. This is so exciting. It was really fun, and it's like some of the most fun I've ever had programming. And so I got more and more into it, and now we're using it at work, and it's been great.
So you mentioned functional programming. So it's functional programming is a paradigm that's been around for a long time, and it's sort of had a recent resurgence. I mean, what makes Elm great for making it the best sort of functional language to get to JavaScript today?
Yeah, so there are a few different options now. Like 5 years ago, pretty much all you had was sort of use the fact that CoffeeScript has everything being an expression to write more functions, but that was about it. And now you got a couple different options. So you have Elm, you have PureScript, you have ClojureScript, and then there are some others that are sort of less popular than those. Are the big three, I would say. And yeah, I guess the thing from my perspective that makes Elm my preferred choice of the three is two things. One is that it has type inference, so it's had a really great compiler that catches almost all of your errors up front. We've been using it in production at work for 6 months, and we have yet to see a single runtime exception from any of our Elm code. It's like thousands and thousands of lines of code, like not even just undefined is not a function. We haven't seen any. And that's because the compiler is just really great at catching that stuff. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it is just that it's simplicity. There's just a lot less to learn with Elm than there are in some of the other functional alternatives out there.
Yeah, I mean, the only time I ever get, no errors in my code is when no one's actually using my code, I feel like, most of the time. So it's always nice to see the compiler does a pretty good job.
We have millions of users answering millions of questions every day, so we're about as far as you can get from nobody using it.
From zero.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. More people should use my stuff internally. That's the problem. I'm staring at a coworker to the right of me, which no one can see on this podcast. But regardless, why learn another language? I mean, a lot of folks come into everyone starts somewhere in the language sort of space, and we all sort of expand out in this world of languages, because there are many languages these days, functional, and some more functional than others. But why use Elm instead of, say, ES 2015? Like, is there, like, do we need to transpile down into JavaScript now from other things? Like, are there benefits to that?
Yeah, definitely. So from my perspective, the main thing is that it's difficult to get the sort of guarantees that you get from Elm that make it such a nice experience as far as maintaining code, refactoring code, and having no runtime exceptions. It's difficult to get that, and I think it's actually impossible to get that by adding on to an existing language. Really what you have to have is you have to start from a language that doesn't have certain things. So the reason Elm's able to do that is that there is no null or undefined. The language is designed around not having that. And you express the idea of like the absence of a value in different ways that can be, verified more easily. So the fact of the matter is, JavaScript has this long legacy. It's been around for a long time. It's had, several iterations, and backwards compatibility is really important. And so you couldn't just go through and say, we're going to take undefined out of JavaScript. It's impossible at this point. So the advantage of going to a new language is you can have sort of a clean slate and say, this is a language that's going to be designed, to learn from these decades of programming language research, all of the experiences people have had with other languages in the past, and, say, how can we do this better from the ground up? And that's what Elm is.
Yeah, and Elm has some just absolutely wonderful features. I mean, I was sort of playing with it last night a little bit, trying to make sure that I could speak somewhat to it, as opposed to just randomly spouting off random words that Justin finds in documents. And it is quite long. It's strongly typed. The fact that it doesn't have null and undefined is magical, really. And if you've never used a language that doesn't have them, it does take you a bit aback, doesn't it? Like, it is a different sort of concept if you come up with JavaScript and go, well, what will I do half my day if I don't track down those null and undefined?
Build working software. It's great.
So feature-wise, I mean, is there a feature in Elm that people just don't know about? Like, is there like that one killer feature that you say, if you knew Elm did this, you might take a look? Like, what would that feature be for you?
Well, the biggest one is definitely no runtime exceptions. Something that comes with that is just that refactoring is really great. I mean, usually when I refactor something, even if it's like, hundreds of lines of code changed, almost always the experience I have is after it compiles again, it just works with no regressions. It's really nice. We write fewer tests and still have, better confidence in what we're shipping because the compiler is really awesome. But besides that, I mean, something that I don't think people know about, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is Elm format. It's relatively new. So this is the Go language has had this thing called Go formatter, or Go Funct, as they call it. And essentially what it does, it's both of them do the same thing, which is you run it on your code and it just formats it. It makes it look pretty. And so I use Sublime Text, and the Sublime Text Elm plugin has a automatic, every time you save, it runs Elm format on your code. And it's great because not only does it make your code look nice, but it makes it look consistent across your whole team. So you can stop having debates over how many spaces of indentation to use and where to put new lines and things like that, because it'll just go through and just do that stuff for you, just make it look good. And so now I spend so much less time thinking about that stuff. And I've actually started using it as sort of like a little, Vim or Emacs style, like code assistant, where instead of like pressing enter and then indenting, in a lot of cases I'll just write some nasty code in like the minimal amount possible and hit save, and then it'll just make it look pretty for me.
Stream of conscious programming, that is the way to go. That's the beauty of formatters, right?
Yeah, it's really great. I mean, I still do some JavaScript and CoffeeScript stuff in addition to Elm. I mean, mostly Elm, but I still do some of the other stuff, and I just miss it every time I'm going through. I hit save and I'm like, why didn't it? Oh, right. Okay. I guess I'll indent it by hand.
I mean, in terms of that though, right? So, I mean, how does Elm fit in like today's sort of workflows? Like, say you do have an existing app and you're like, oh man, I'm really tired of this particular piece of that app, and I'm gonna start to bring Elm into my project. I mean, how has that worked in your experience?
Well, the way I did it was basically just starting by building a small thing and introducing it into our project at work. Specifically, what I did, so we were on React and Flux, and that's what we've been using for a while. And so I just rewrote one of our Flux stores in Elm, and I actually wrote a blog post about this. It's called. This is not in the show notes. I guess we could add it to the show notes, but
we will add it to the show notes. It will be
right.
so.
Yeah. And so basically what I did is I just rewrote one of our stores, and in the blog post I go through taking the Flux to do MVC app and doing the same thing and rewriting one of their big store in Elm. And so it's interesting because Elm and JavaScript sort of operate in different worlds, and so the way that Elm maintains a lot of its guarantees is by making it so that the way JavaScript interop works is not by sharing code, but rather by communicating to and from JavaScript, just sending data back and forth, much like you'd talk to a server. And so I basically had to pick some sort of boundary to set that data back and forth. And I thought, oh, well, a Flux store is a pretty natural way to do that because it's just all about sending data to and from the rest of your application with getters and setters. So I just re-implemented all the getters and setters in Elm. And that was it. And then so we sort of got that into production and then said, wow, we like this. Let's do more. And so we just sort of expanded from there. And now pretty much 95% of our whole front end team is just writing Elm all day. And we pretty much just write JavaScript for interoperating with Elm and if we have some legacy code to maintain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a powerful sort of story. I mean, a lot of times when you see people come into web development, everyone sort of has their flavor of what they like to do, and a lot of times that requires like, oh, you know what, I don't like your product at all, I'm in charge now, we're destroying all of it, it goes all away at once, which is not really a feasible approach if you want to continue to have a job and or be in business for long. Yeah. So it's it's always interesting to me to say, because we've had other folks on the podcast that take similar approaches where I have this one small thing, it doesn't work quite the way I want, maybe I rewrite it in this, or we have this new implementation, it's fairly tiny, let's introduce this, and in a lot of places that's hard, right? I mean, you end up with pitchforks and torches and please, I don't want your ASP version 1 from 1997 in my code base anymore. Not to say that I'm writing ASP1 code base anymore. I mean, it happens from time to time. Someone says, bring it up, and it's sad. But the reality being is that it can be tough, right? I mean, have you seen a lot of Elm uptick in other sort of businesses? Because I read through quite a few blog posts where people are taking similar approaches when they're actually implementing Elm for the first time, and then all of a sudden it sort of snowballs into a much larger thing to where it's now running on Elm.
Yeah, definitely. Especially in the past year, I've seen a lot of that. And I think the reason for that is that Elm's been around for about 3 years, but only in the past 2 years, I guess, did it have a React-like story where you could have a declarative virtual DOM style renderer. And I think that really was the sort of the tipping point. And now it's become, this language where you can sort of write code for the DOM in the way that people really like to and have great performance and yet also have really maintainable code. Because it seems like now, React has sort of spawned this idea of, wow, here's a great way to do functional programming in the browser. It's a great way to write declarative views, and people love it. The only downside is that it's difficult to maintain, and that's why I think you're seeing like Flow and things like that showing up. But compared to Elm, where Flow and so forth are basically sort of like putting band-aids over the historical design of JavaScript. But the reality is it wasn't designed to be a sort of reliable, maintainable language for large projects. It was designed to be a tiny scripting language. And expecting it to be this thing that it has become is really kind of a tough sell.
It's a bit amazing. Well, it's a bit amazing that it became the thing that it became.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, there is quite a bit of, to that though, right? I mean, a lot of people, it's easy to start a project, right? We all, Greenfield is a wonderful thing because you don't necessarily, you're not encumbered by, designs of the past. But the problem is that eventually Greenfield does become that past story, and then maintenance becomes a big, part of that. And when the maintenance story is not very clear, it strikes me that things like Elm and other sort of tooling and or languages and approaches sort of seem to fill that niche where it becomes easier to maintain. Do you find that programmers who have worked in JavaScript primarily who come on to Elm to see how that maintenance works, do you feel like they take fairly readily to it?
Yeah, I think as long as you come into it, sort of with an open mind, being willing to learn. Because, I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you want something to be significantly better than the status quo, that sort of implies that it's going to be significantly different from the status quo. Exactly. So you can't, just show up to Elm and think, well, it's going to be just like JavaScript, only better. Because in reality, what it is it's just different from JavaScript. And there are a lot of pros there, but there are also some drawbacks. Some things are going to get harder. There's going to be some learning curve in some areas. And that's sort of the price of admission to getting all the benefits. And so I've been fortunate that, I have a lot of coworkers who are, sort of open-minded and willing to give new things a try. And especially in the JavaScript world where there's a lot of fatigue around all of the different frameworks and all the different, options out there.
I feel like fatigue is a very kind word for that syndrome. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
Oh, no. Well, yeah. I mean, a frustration, there's there's a lot there. And so I'm asking people to try something significantly different, when there are so many different things out there, it's a difficult proposition in this day and age. But like I said, fortunately, I have coworkers who are willing to give it a shot. And I guess the most extreme example of this is my coworker Tessa. She was just coming off of a coding boot camp. She'd never done, programming. I guess she did like some Mathematica in college, and that was it. And then she learned JavaScript in a few months. And then on her first week on the job, this being her first professional programming job, by the end of it, she was writing, Elm for production. And, that's not a typical story, but there's no reason it couldn't be.
Yeah, I think people are more adept at expanding sort of their language knowledge these days. Language, I mean, there are just so many choices in the field depending on where you particularly work, whether it's back end or front end or, somewhere in between, where all of a sudden, I know that we've taken JavaScript and put it in some absolutely crazy places, and I think that's a very intriguing story. Because some places I'm not sure that that's necessarily where it should be, but there it is. So, I'm always curious to see what people's learning process is around new languages, because when I was coming up, because I'm old and ancient these days, you didn't really do that so much. Like you had one core thing that you did, and that was the language that you knew. But these days, you really do have to sort of have quite a few quivers, or quite a few arrows in your quiver, and sort of the language of things, and not just for the web, but for platforms in general.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think there are more and more polyglot programmers out there. I look back at the last, I guess, decade or so of my career, and I can think of off the top of my head at least a half dozen languages I've used. Several, sometimes, in one given job, I'd be using 3 or 4 different languages. That seems to be the way of things now.
Yeah, so it is nice to see that, if you took a junior dev like that and said, good news, you just learned JavaScript. That's great, but here's a new language you have to learn. I think that's a very, an interesting story, because a lot of people won't do that. They will not jump into that thing. And if you can get up to speed that quick, that's a that's a compelling story. It makes it easy to say, hey, maybe we should try this, where it doesn't take you. Now, your level of mastery may be different in a year as opposed to the first month, but at the end of the day, it's accessible. And there's a lot of documentation on the site these days, right? I mean, versions are continuously rolling out now.
Yeah, there's a lot of documentation around the language itself. There are increasing number of blog posts and things like that. There's a great community called Elm Discuss. It's a mailing list, a Google group. There's an Elm Slack channel. And there's the community is just getting bigger and bigger. It feels like every couple of weeks now I see somebody posting that they started a new Elm community in some new city. I think Chicago is about to have their first meetup. Seattle had theirs recently. Utah. I mean, there's just like showing up all over the place. It's pretty cool.
And I mean, is building language communities like this hard? Like I've never done it, to be honest. I run community sort of events. And languages, I mean, you can get, there can be a lot of arguments around languages. That sort of grow out of, what people have learned in the past, what is good per se, with air quotes around it. Have you found that to be fairly spontaneous? Like, I mean, these things popping up out of nowhere. I mean, it seems to me that once communities start to pop up, that means that there are projects around that weren't there before.
I think that's exactly what it is. I mean, we have, these sort of online communities. And I think generally what will happen is that someone will start picking up Elm in some particular city and they'll start getting excited about it. They'll start building things with it. And then they'll start talking about it to their friends. I think I inadvertently sort of seeded the St. Louis Elm community because I was at a wedding with two of my friends, and I was sitting at the table and they were, of course we were discussing, what are you up to lately? And I started saying, well, I've gotten really into this language called Elm. And she said, oh, what's Elm? Let's talk about it. This is Jessica Kerr, Jessitron on Twitter. And so we were chatting, and she started taking notes, and then she went back and started playing around with it. She's like, this is really great. And now, there's a St. Louis Elm meetup. She's co-authoring a book on Elm. And it's just like these things just sort of snowball just from people, finding out about it and trying it out and getting excited about it.
Yeah, and that's I love to hear stories like that because it's the little seeds that grow into like major sort of shifts, or major sort of like, oh wow, I can do my job significantly faster and better, and I can drink more coffee. Actually, I'm probably the only one who thinks that. But with every high side of all the good things, there's always downsides. There must be some downside amongst Elm. And, as opposed to things like JavaScript or other things on the web platform. Are there any pratfalls that people should look out for?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that the two biggest drawbacks to Elm are, I'll name three, actually. So I would say that the three biggest drawbacks are, one, that it's a very new language, and so that there comes with that sort of the size of the community is not as big as the JavaScript community. You don't have nearly as many libraries as you do in NPM as you do on the Elm package manager. Although I will note, maybe I should have answered this as the feature that people don't know about. The Elm package manager enforces semantic versioning. So if you try to publish, So every single package, if you try to publish a breaking change and you don't increment the major version number, it will reject it automatically. It won't let you publish it.
Now that's a nice feature.
Yeah. It's really nice. It makes everything very reliable. But by the same token, there are not nearly as many libraries on there as there are on NPM. On average, the quality is much higher, but it's much smaller. Fortunately, there is JavaScript interop, so you can fall back on NPM if you need to access something from there. But of course, the stuff you access through NPM is not going to have all the nice guarantees as the stuff that you get through the package manager. So that's the first downside, is just that it's smaller, it's just less mature. The ecosystem is not as large. Second downside is learning curve. If you're coming to it from JavaScript, there's just stuff you have to learn to get productive in it. And more so than like CoffeeScript or TypeScript, which are both, preserving JavaScript semantics and just sort of changing certain things. Elm is, like I said, built from the ground up to be different. So there's significantly more to learn there. And then the third drawback I would say is just that the way, by nature of Elm's design, is it's designed to solve the problem of maintainability and reliability. And so it's not as good for prototyping. The observation we've had is, like, if we've got a feature that we're shipping over the course of a month, comparing what it will take to do that feature in JavaScript versus what it'll take to do it in Elm, the experience we've had is it'll be a lot faster to get an sort of something up on the screen, something up and running that we can look at and play with in JavaScript. It's definitely faster to do that, to get from 0 to something that we can show. But over the course of that whole month, the cost of getting it all the way to something we can ship in production that we're going to be maintaining for months and years to come is significantly lower in Elm. So by the time it gets to our users, Elm has saved us time. But that's sort of that first little bit to get it up and get a project that we can try out and do user testing on and stuff is still faster in JavaScript. So the downside is that there's a little bit more upfront that you have to do just to get things up and running. And really the reason for that is because Elm is both very good at detecting edge cases and telling you about them, but also it sort of requires you to deal with them. In JavaScript, the thing that makes it less reliable, which is that you can just ignore a lot of edge cases, and then they come back to bite you later.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the thing about edge cases,
right? But being able to ignore them does let you get a prototype out faster. Being able to say, like, I'm not going to deal with this right now. In Elm, you have to be more explicit and say, okay, this thing is here, but I'm going to explicitly choose not to deal with it or hack around it or something like that. Elm makes it a lot harder to just ignore those things, which means it takes longer to get prototypes out.
Yeah, I mean, prototyping these days it makes me furrow my brow sometimes when you look at the platform and in general, because I mean there is sort of this growing, the web platform's too complicated. Like, well, I need to like clone like half of NPM to make my project build, or I need to why can't I just drop this in and things work? I mean, right. Is the web platform for even just any prototyping at this point getting too complicated, or are we simply making it too complicated?
I think, honestly, I prefer to go sort of, I like to have two extremes. I like to have sort of my nice setup for production that maybe takes longer to get set up. So I got Webpack, I've got Elm, I got all these, modern conveniences. And then I've got my prototyping setup, which is just jQuery. Like, that's it. I'm like, this is something I'm going to hack together. I am knowing, from day 0, I'm going to throw this away. I'm going to throw it in the incinerator as soon as I get the design that I want. Mm-hmm. And I'm just hacking this together so that I can try it out with a user. And having those two extremes means that, number one, I don't feel bad at all about writing horribly hacky copy-pasted code through my prototype. And it's a very simple, minimal setup. I just include jQuery on the page through a CDN and then go. I don't even do a CSS preprocess or anything because, again, I'm not gonna maintain this. This is just for trying something out. And then once I get the design I like, then I throw it out and then start writing with Webpack, Elm, Sass, stuff like that. And it's nice. It takes longer, but it ends up something that's totally maintainable.
Yeah, and I want to stress the maintainability of it. I mean, because I think people, the kicker is that sometimes our prototypes become the thing that we have to maintain. And in that scenario, you do have to be careful, or at least with certain types of clientele that are just like, oh, it looks good enough for me. I think we should use this right now.
Right.
Ignore the fact that it's not wired to anything.
Right.
Except itself for the most part. But the maintainability is sort of huge these days, and if you're not thinking about maintainability, you should be thinking about maintainability. Please do, if you're out there and saying to yourself, I don't need to worry about edge cases.
Well, the thing about that is that if you don't, you end up having to worry about it after the fact, right? I mean, 6 months from when you started, that's when the chickens come home to roost, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning going, whose idea was this? And then you're looking at the commits going, oh, that was my horrible idea. I made poor choices that day. Because every choice looks poor at 3 a.m.
Yeah. Truth.
So what should people know about, we talked a little bit about the language. We know that there is some learning curve, that it's not, obviously it's not a one-to-one with JavaScript. Are there things that people should know just coming in? Like if I was someone who was relatively new to, a language or two, like what were some things about Elm that I should probably know that I may not know going in straight away?
Sure. So here are 3 things that definitely take some getting used to. One is that everything is immutable. There are no mutations anywhere. You can't mutate stuff. So like just strings are immutable in JavaScript. You can't, you make one, and then if you want to change, quote unquote, change it, you make a new one. Everything's like that in Elm. Arrays, lists, whatever, all data structures. They use persistent data structures under the hood, which is how they're able to get really nice benchmarks. But yeah, so every time you want to make a new thing, you're copying, quote unquote, an old one. Although in practice, it's not actually going to copy the whole thing. Everything is immutable. Second thing is that everything is effectively const. You don't reassign things either. So you mutate and you don't reassign. It's just passing values from one thing to another. Everything's an expression, so that it's pretty easy to do that. Then the third thing is that there are no side effects anywhere. So whenever you want to do some sort of effect like Ajax or something like that, Elm uses what's called managed effects, which is essentially, so in JavaScript, you might return a promise. And in Elm, instead of a promise, they have this thing called a task. And a task is just a value that describes what you want done. So the task might say, I want to have an Ajax request happen that does this or that. And then afterwards, I want to do some other stuff. So you can chain these tasks together and so forth. But the relevant part is that tasks are like callbacks in that when you instantiate them, they don't do anything right away. When you instantiate a task, it's just a description of what you want done. You can instantiate 100 of them. It's not going to do a single Ajax request. So your whole program, because of these 3 things put together, becomes a series of data transformations. You're just instantiating values and then passing them around. And then at the end of the day, you hand them off to the sort of the Elm runtime. And then it translates all of that into an imperative JavaScript program that's going to actually run commands one at a time. So it definitely takes some getting used to being like, every single function I have is full of immutable stuff, not reassigning anything. I'm not making any side effects happen. But then once I wire it all together, then it turns into a running program that works. So
yeah, and I think that's an important difference too, right? I mean, in terms of it's a very functional programming paradigm, right? It's functional programming at its most, and people often forget about side effects. Like even when they're writing other languages where they're sort of writing in a functional paradigm, and they're going, I don't understand why this is this way. It's because you have a side effect in no, don't do that. Because that's the whole thing, right? It can be tough when the language doesn't necessarily form to fit that paradigm.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You see things like in React, you'll see it says like, hey, don't do side effects in your render function. Like you can, but please don't, because it might break things. In Redux, you'll see in the docs that it says, when you're writing your reducers, like don't use side effects here. You can, but please don't. Whereas in Elm, it's actually basically enforced that you don't. You never have side effects. And if you're wondering whether or not a particular function might do Ajax, all you have to do is look at what it returns. If it returns a task, then yeah, that task might do some Ajax. But if it doesn't return a task, if it just returns a string, or if it just returns an integer, or if it just returns some HTML, that function is not doing anything to do with Ajax. It's not doing anything with local storage. It's not doing any effects whatsoever, because it's just right there in the return type. It's either a task or it's not. And so when you have your render functions in Elm, you know that they don't have side effects because they don't return tasks. When you look at your stores, the equivalent of your stores or your reducers in Elm, you know that they don't return a task, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, and that's I think that's a very powerful feature actually, because I think that 50% of web development these days is worrying about what's going to happen when you've bundled in so many things together to try to do something that you do end up with something that is unexpected. And that's tough because then you go on the great trail of bug hunting that is, why did it do this? Whose fault is this?
Right.
Is it our fault? The normal sorts of things. And I think Elm plays very strongly to that. I like the idea of tasks and not having to worry about side effects because you're inherently, you're designed to not write that sort of code that would frankly come back and bite you later. Again, that 3 a.m. phone call where you're going, man, I made horrible decisions last month.
Right.
I don't know what was wrong. Did I fail to eat the candy bar of choice that day? What was wrong?
Another nice thing about tasks is that, so in JavaScript, you have 3 different ways to do effects and 3 different ways to handle errors. So the 3 different ways to make effects are: 1, you make a synchronous function call that has a side effect. 2 is you call something and give it a callback. And then 3 is you use a promise. So all 3 of those in Elm are just replaced by tasks. There's only one way to do it, and it's the nice way. Tasks compose together like promises do. You can do the equivalent of like promise.all and batch them up and have them run and say, I don't care, what order these run in, just tell me when they're all done, stuff like that. So you get all the benefits of promises, but all the time. Like everyone uses it because that's all there is. You don't have to, deal with this like, oh, this library used a promise and this one used a callback and this did it synchronously. That's all. There's just one. It's just tasks. It's just the nice thing.
One nice thing would be much better than sort of 3 not so nice things, I think.
Yeah. And the other cool thing is the error handling. So in JavaScript, you have you have exceptions, and then you have calling a callback, passing an error argument, and then you have promises, which have their own concept of errors. And again, in Elm, there's just error handling through tasks, which works the same way that promise error handling does, except that also takes the place of exceptions. So there's no try catch in Elm. There's just handling errors through tasks. So you don't have to worry about like, did my promise swallow my exception? Is somebody else doing a try catch here? It's like, nope. It's just if there's an error, it's going to be handled right there in the task in the same way that you would have a reject and a promise.
Yeah, and I think that again, like that's really nice.
Yeah.
Like it does, like for the learning curve to learn about Elm, it does take out some of the learning curve of learning the 27 different ways to do things in other languages.
Oh yeah,
right? I think. I mean, because it's sort of an old story, and in JavaScript, I mean, some people like to tease JavaScript. I do as well. And JavaScript, the language, is getting better.
It's a love-hate relationship for all of us.
It's a love-hate relationship for all of us. We, some days are better than others. But all languages sort of have these sort of, pratfalls and sort of things that, make us think twice. And it's nice when languages sort of, and there are a lot of nice languages being designed now that sort of deal with a lot of these problems, both for the web and not for the web. What's your worst thing? Like if one thing could be fixed in Elm, like what would that one thing be? Because every language has got it that just goes, why is it this way? And then you just shake your head and learn to deal with it, and hope one day. But like, what would that feature be for you?
The one thing, I don't know if this counts as a language feature. So there's this tool called Elm Reactor, and aka the time traveling debugger. And this is like kind of the original one, like before like JavaScript had time travel and things like that. And I guess like some like Redux, you can have like time travel and stuff like that. So Elm inspired a lot of those because with this cool demo of being able to go back in time. The trouble is that it doesn't currently work with the JavaScript interop. the port system, which means that if you do JavaScript interop, you can't use the time traveling debugger, which is really annoying because I want to use it because it's so cool, but I can't because, of course, like I said, there's still this big library, this JavaScript ecosystem. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we do JavaScript interop, and so we can't use it. So I'm told that a fix is in the works, but it hasn't come out yet. And then once it supports that, I'll be much happier. But until then, I will angrily shake my fist.
I mean, and to that, precompiled languages for the web, like general thoughts, like, I mean, good thing, bad thing, why thing?
Yeah. So I think, I guess there's two parts to that. One is just compiling to JavaScript in general, and then two is having a compiler that actually checks things. So to the first part, the question of compiling things to JavaScript in general, I think that's here to stay. I think Babel is, if you think about it, one way to think of Babel is, we want to use the JavaScript features of tomorrow today. But the thing is, if that's something that's going to become part of your build chain and that's not a big deal, well, what happens tomorrow? Aren't you still going to want the JavaScript features of next week? And when you get to next week, aren't you still going to want the JavaScript features of the week after that? I mean, there's always going to be more stuff coming out. This is programming. There's no, end where we say, we're done. We've hit the end of programming. Everything's done. We don't need to, there are no more new features.
I could have swore there was a silver jumpsuit moment in our future. Like, I did not get that memo. I was really hoping for, one silver jumpsuit. This is what we're doing in the programming community from now on. That's it. Well, I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure I stole that from Jerry Seinfeld. So
maybe, but if I were betting, man, that's not what I'd bet on. But the point is, if you're going to be using Babel today, you're going to be using Babel tomorrow, next week, next month. I mean, you're going to be using it indefinitely. And at that point, if you're already committed to having, a part of your build chain where you're compiling something to JavaScript, does the thing that you're compiling to JavaScript need to be another dialect of JavaScript? Why not choose something else? Might as well.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think that it's not going away. Like, I think it is here to stay. It only seems to make sense now, particularly for the web platform, because it does move so quickly at this point. Where we had a lull sort of for a while, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a lull. I guess it was just standards are being defined, and trees are being cut down to make bridges and spears to spear features into the platform. So that we can all have a kind of a nicer day. So yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, I think it's. I don't think it's going to go away any particular day of the week. I mean, some people seem to not like that idea, but I don't really know why. Because it doesn't necessarily hurt if you're not using, compiling down into JavaScript from something else. Like you're at no loss. Like you can write the code that you want to write. Like, so I don't. And maintainability wise, again, I think maintainability these days is really highly underrated. I mean, because so many new things come out so quickly, it is nice to know that, well, this language operates only in, this targeted way, not in 27 variation ways, not because, you had a minor revision bump. The minor revision bump, ladies and gentlemen, is the most annoying thing. Please, for the love of Peach, just properly version your code so that I don't have to file tickets going, please, just I'll patch it. I will send you the pull request. Let's all be nice with our versioning so that we all know what exactly is going on the web or elsewhere.
To the point of this podcast, like the web platform is the exciting thing to me. I mean, the web is the best app delivery platform the world has ever seen. I mean, you literally can't do better than I type in the name of the thing I want to use and then I'm using it. There's no download, there's no installation, there's no waiting for updates. It's just you type it, you literally just tell the computer, here's what I want to use, and the next step is you're using it, the latest version of it. Right? I mean, we've never done better than that. And if you think about it, that's only one step. How do you do better than that? I mean, the computer has to read your mind to do better than that as a delivery mechanism. We have to go into the realm of science fiction to do better than what the web already does today. And when I look at that, that's what's exciting to me. And the idea that what has to be exciting is specifically the language of JavaScript as it exists in browsers today. That's what's exciting about the web? I don't think so. I think what's exciting about the web is the way that it makes app delivery happen.
It is magical, and it's funny because I started just before the web really took off in the sort of the mid '90s when we started having dial-up and whatnot, and then the web sort of comes in and the .com boom hits, and I remember working on like IE4. Just building stuff in. Yeah,
Netscape Communicator back in the day.
Yeah, those were the days. Like document.all, ladies and gentlemen, it was a thing, and document.layers. And people are like, I don't know what that is, and I hope you never have to know what that is again on the web. Yeah. But even in that environment where there were quite a few differences, as sort of the lay of the land was being sort of set. The web continued to win. Like, you're right? Because it was this instant delivery of, here is your stuff, and you can use it, and you're up to date against this thing. And now we've got like things like progressive web apps with Service Worker sort of in the cards now, which are awesome. Love it so much. And it is, regardless of the language you decide to write in, these days, like, you get that power, right? I mean, you can compile down in JavaScript. The DOM, I know some people don't like the DOM. I think the DOM is quite performant. Justin's Opinion 101. I'll leave Shadow DOM out of this one today. So,
well, the thing about the DOM that's really cool is just that it's a very rich interactive system that has been, adopted widely and that is still sort of semantically useful. If you were just rendering to pixels, you can get a ton of bleeding edge performance. But if you want to come write a plugin for that, you're out of luck. I mean, I love the fact that I can bring up any web page that I use and I can mess with it. I can add, I have like extensions that let me write CSS to, mess around with the pages I'm looking at. I can't do that with a native app. I love the fact that I can just, search for anything on the page. I've had so many native apps where I'm like, Command F. Nope. Command F. Please, Command F. Right? But on the web, it just works. And so just having this sort of, universal specification for here's how to make a, content-rich page. There are lots of drawbacks to the DOM too, but fundamentally having a semantic description of your UI is something that we've never had in programming before. And it's by far the most successful implementation of that. And it's just like definitely an undervalued aspect of web development.
Yeah, no, I think, I think the debate will always rage on, because otherwise, what would we have to talk about on various shows and whatnot?
Don't get me wrong, I have plenty of criticisms of the API, but as a construct, it's a very useful one.
Yeah, and I think it's always interesting because you start to look through, the API, and a lot of the listeners obviously are building for the web these days, and some are new to it, some have been doing it for a long time, and I like the community. It's okay to argue about how APIs work. Maybe not on mailing lists, because mailing lists are horrible, but and other sort of mailing lists can be troublesome to sort of follow what the chain of logic was. Half the time, I don't even know what the original question was on most of the mailing lists these days. But it is. You look at TC39 and everything, the other sorts of bodies and corporations and people who are putting in a massive amount of work to sort of bring the web platform up to date. I mean, everybody knows I'm a huge fan of Service Worker. Like as someone who, I know you mentioned App Cache at the beginning, and I cringe because I'm like, well, we could just talk about App Cache and how much it's horrible. But I don't think that was the point of today's episode. Maybe another episode. App Cache, the black box that continues to ruin your 2 a.m. You could, there is quite a bit of hope, even with those sorts of bugs and things that exist today. So it is good times.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of stuff, Richard. I mean, what is the thing that I forgot to ask that Eric or Danny would have asked, because I forget a lot of things? What is the thing I missed that I should have asked you that we should have talked about Elm?
So one of the things that people ask is that a lot of new languages crop up and then they don't end up with long-term support. You get a language creator wanders off and does something else. You get the maintainers stop having time for it and things like that. And so one of these questions is that is Elm going to be around in 3 to 5 years? And so previously, Evan Czaplicki is the creator of Elm, and previously he'd been working at Prezi, and they were paying him basically to develop the language. And actually, just last week, we announced my company. I work for No Red Ink, and we make grammar and writing software for English teachers, and we're hiring, by the way.
Nice.
And we just announced last week that we hired Evan. So now we believe that we are the company making the strongest Elm investment in the world now, because it's been unbelievably great for us, and it's also been a big deal for hiring, because people want to just come work here because they get to work in Elm. And so we're like, yeah, you know what? It's time for us to give back to the open source community in a very direct financial way, because we benefited a lot from it, and it's helped make us a financially successful company. So why don't we use some of that financial success to give back? And so that should at least allay some of people's concerns about what's the future of Elm. The future of Elm is very bright and has explicit financial support in addition to a large community effort. So,
and that's key. It can be hard to get behind something when you don't see that growth. But I would say that Elm has shown like a great deal of growth, even outside of the commercial aspect of it, where people are actually supporting that language and whatever else. And that's a testament to how good it is to write in, I think. I haven't written much in it. I just started sort of playing with it, but I love a new language. So, gotta write some things just to see and see how it fits into the equation. Daily work.
Yeah.
So I think that's fantastic. Well, wonderful. Well, we're running up against time at the moment. Richard, how do people find you on the internet if they want to bug you about Elm or just random web platform things?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is Twitter, twitter.com/RTFeldman. That'll be in the show notes. And I'm happy to chat about Elm, about anything else. Star Wars.
And I'm going to have to convince Eric and Danny that we need a Star Wars themed episode, because
Sure.
there have been quite there was the Polymer Star Wars bit too this year, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other web apps that have been built around the Star Wars concept. If anybody hadn't heard, Star Wars came out in December. Just in case you've not been on Earth at this point.
highest grossing movie. If you want to look it up, that's one way to look it up.
So yeah, it's been great having you on the show, Richard. Thank you so very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been episode 76 of the Elm Programming Language. I'm your host, Justin Ribeiro, and this has been the Web Platform Podcast. Thank you very much for listening.